On October 11th, 2008, a man named Scott Allen Freeman showed up to a home on County Road 2683 in rural Texas, surrounded by no trespassing signs, security cameras, and sally ports guarding the entryway. Freeman was there for a night of drinking and partying, but he'd been so nervous about coming over that he tried in vain to convince friends to accompany him. But as night gave way to dawn, with no signs of danger, Freeman and his hosts got into two separate cars to embark on a trip to the nearby city of Cleveland, Texas. Freeman never made it there. On the morning of October 12th, a passing motorist discovered his bullet-riddled body lying next to Freeman's pickup truck on a turnout off Farm to Market Road 787. When police arrived, they recognized him instantly. He was known by the nickname Arizona, and served as a high-ranking member in the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, or ABT, a white supremacist gang with a military-like structure that has a strong presence throughout the entire state of Texas, both inside and outside of prison. Freeman had gotten himself caught in a web of political and personal problems, and this was the result. By the end of the police investigation, which took years, an ABT general named Steve Stain Cook and a soldier named David Jason Michaels had been arrested and charged with luring Freeman out of his car, gunning him down, and attempting to cover up the crime. Incarcerated leaders of the ABT had used a cell phone smuggled in by a corrupt guard to issue the kill order with cool, calculated efficiency, knowing that their command would be obeyed on pain of death. For the ABT, it was just one of countless brazen violent crimes committed inside and outside of prison, as the gang grew from a small group of state prison inmates seeking protection to a network of 5 factions, collectively known as the Wheel. The ABT has several creeds, but one known as GFBD stands out among them. It means, God forgives, brothers don't. But today's episode isn't merely about the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, so much as it is about the sheer terror that the gang is able to instill in others. It is enough to drive people to murder their friends without the ABT even having to lift a finger. Today we will be delving into a gang known as the Solid Wood Soldiers. It has been labeled a support group for the ABT, and appears to shadow much of the larger prison gang with its paramilitary structure, its code of conduct, white supremacist philosophy, and even its drug of choice, methamphetamine. The Solid Wood Soldiers, or SWS for short, started in the Texas prison system in the 1990s. Originally, SWS was formed under the acronym Stupid Woods. Over time, it came to mean Separate White State. For those that don't know, the word wood is commonly adopted slang for peckerwood, and a group of active white gangsters in prison is commonly referred to as the woodpile. The SWS uses a ranking system with the president, vice president, council member, major, captain, all the way down to soldier, where people can be promoted or demoted depending on their conduct. Its symbol incorporates a wolf paw with 2 lightning bolt-style letter S's on either side of a W, and the numbers 14 and 10 at the bottom. The 1410 refers to 2 pacts that have been embraced by many white supremacist movements around North America. The 14-word pledge is an oath to, quote, secure the existence of our race and future, end quote, while the 10 words say, quote, unity is the only solution to the white man's revolution, end quote. People can become members through a prospecting phase, but unlike many hardcore prison gangs that have a blood-in, blood-out credence, SWS allows people to be jumped in and jumped out, where they simply have to endure a beating, according to police. On the spectrum of white gangs, some, such as the Aryan Circle, serve mainly to promote a white supremacist philosophy, while others, such as the California-based Aryan Brotherhood, may incorporate racist symbols, but more generally exist as a traditional criminal organization that is willing to ally with gangs of other races to make money. While estimations of the Solid Wood Soldiers' membership have varied greatly, in this investigation we're about to cover, authorities claimed they had identified more than 100 SWS members and associates operating both inside and outside of prison. And members are still showing up in the news, most recently last January, when an SWS member was arrested for allegedly trafficking meth and allowing his property to be used for storing various stolen automobiles and trailers. But in the early 2010s, the gang was operating with a very specific purpose in mind: to sell enough methamphetamine that its members could afford to buy a property in order to create a separatist whites-only community somewhere in Texas, which they estimated would cost the grand total of $30,000. At the time, the SWS was being led by a man named Craig Phipps, aka Lone Wolf, who was attempting to give the gang cover for its illegal businesses through sophisticated money laundering schemes to write off illegal funds as donations to a fictitious nonprofit organization. It just so happened that Phipps was incarcerated in federal prison for a conviction of being a felon in possession of firearms, but he had a release date on the horizon, and in the meantime, there were people on the outside he felt he could trust. Namely, there was Christopher Lee Guidry, an SWS captain who went by the nickname Hollywood, and Tanner Lynn Bork, who used the monikers Two Shoes and Hitman, and who served as a council member. Together, the two were determined to run a meth operation based in Vidor, Texas, a small town near the eastern border where the Ku Klux Klan was known to openly operate during the 1980s and 90s. Their plan had one major hang-up. Bork and Guidry lacked connections to the type of drug dealers necessary to support such an operation, so the two decided to start making the drug themselves, using so-called shake-and-bake method. Recent restrictions on YouTube prevent us from going into the details of this method, other than to say it's extremely crude and unsanitary, so much so that many meth addicts turn up their noses to it. They continued this way, selling small amounts to whoever would buy it, but not pulling in the type of funds they envisioned. Eventually, Guidry and Bork made a new connection that would change everything. They were introduced to a woman named Vicky Stark Fitz, an associate of many SWS and ABT members who lived about an hour west of Vidor, and was able to obtain crystal meth that had been manufactured in Mexico from a middleman in Houston. Stark Fitz was what ABT and SWS members generally referred to as a featherwood, slang for a woman that has earned the trust of the gang, but is not a member. This new connection not only allowed Bork and Guidry to start offering higher quality drugs to their customers, but to traffic in greater amounts. And soon, Vicky Stark Fitz found herself at the center of a growing meth operation where members of both gangs relied on her heavily. Their group came to include Kenny Don Stanley, an SWS soldier, as well as Steve Claude Gribble, aka Space Ghost, a drug dealer who was one of Stark Fitz's customers. There was also James Settle, an up-and-coming SWS member known as Lil Bit. Settle had joined the gang in a Texas jail after his own mother, Vivian, turned him into police out of concern for her son, desperate to stave off his criminality. But the move badly backfired. In jail, Settle was introduced to more sophisticated criminals and allowed his worst impulses to thrive. And later justified his newfound gang membership by telling Vivian, quote, "Well, Mama, you've got to have some friends in there." On the ABT side of the network were Mickle Milky Cunningham, an ABT member, Michael Taylor Word, an ABT associate, and Joshua Mark Bodine, aka Desperado, a major in the ABT who operated a compound for the gang at 1575 Cheyenne in Vidor. As a high-ranking member, Bodine had the ability to order others to commit acts of violence, and ABT rules dictate that such orders are to be obeyed without question. Thanks to her connections, Stark Fitz was able to supply the group with not only drugs, but firearms, and relied on them to sell her methamphetamine and collect debts from drug customers. It was a profitable business, but one that required those involved to do a lot of driving around South Texas, and to be on their guard. However, as typically happens with methamphetamine rings, several of the people involved were users themselves, as well as traffickers, and it was just a matter of time before major problems began. March 11, 2011 changed everything. On that day, Mickle Cunningham's mother, Juanette, ordered meth from Gribble and Settle for herself and Michael Word. The two measured out the drugs, secured one of Stark Fitz's firearms, and met Word at a convenience store before he took them back to Juanette's home on Elliott Street in Vidor. But at the property, an argument arose, and Settle ended up shooting Word with Stark Fitz's pistol. Word survived, but details of the shooting spread quickly around the small town. SWS's leaders quickly realized that they had a major problem on their hands. Not only was Juanette's son an ABT member, but Word was an associate, and subjected to a lot of the same protections as a full-fledged member. SWS badly needed to present some kind of peace offering, and time was running out for all of them. Texans, and especially other white gang members, don't need to be reminded of the ABT's ruthlessness, but there were plenty of reminders around. For one thing, just 2 weeks before Word was shot, Bodine's ABT compound in Vidor had been raided by the Orange County Sheriff and Pinehurst Police over a 2009 kidnapping attempt that had resulted in a shooting. Bodine, a major in the ABT, had ordered a member named John Oliver Manning, aka Fish, to abduct and assault an ABT associate named Matthew Fales over a drug debt. Manning attempted to carry out the order, but Fales fought back, and Manning had shot him during the struggle. Fales was hospitalized and survived, and 2 years later, the feds decided they had had enough evidence to charge Bodine and Manning with racketeering. Similarly, just 6 months earlier, Stephen Cook and David Michaels had been arrested and charged with murdering Freeman. Over the 2-year investigation, authorities learned that Freeman was on one side of a schism within the ABT. Freeman worked under a leader named Frank E. Roche Jr., aka Poncho, a man known as the General of Generals, who was feuding with the faction led by another general, Jason Lee Hankins, known as Trooper. Cook was loyal to Trooper and learned that Freeman had been attempting to recruit ABT members from Trooper's faction into Poncho's faction. There were also rumors that Freeman had inappropriate contact with another gang member's underage daughter. After a group of ABT members in prison authorized the hit, Cook and Michaels invited Freeman over to Cook's home in Rye. The following morning, as Freeman drove in one car and Cook, Michaels, and 2 women drove in another, they had convinced Freeman to pull over on the lonely road to let one of the women into his truck, so Cook's truck wouldn't be as crowded. When Freeman exited, Cook shot him in the head, then filled his chest with bullets. By the time Cook and Michaels were arrested, police had not only identified all as the culprits, they'd even fished the murder weapon out of a Texas lake. The murder would pay big dividends for police, as the investigation led to a raid of Cook's home that turned up a 50-gallon drum containing thousands of pages of gang ledgers, notes, pictures, constitutions, and other secrets. But as that case was being prosecuted in early 2011, it served as one more example of what can happen when you tangle with the ABT. SWS's leaders knew full well that in a straight-up conflict with the ABT, all of their lives could be forfeit. So they decided they didn't even want to wait for reprisal. They would handle their supposedly close friend, Settle, themselves. On March 13th, 2011, Stark Fitz hosted a meeting at her home with Bork, Guidry, and Stanley to discuss how to handle the Settle problem. Bork made it clear that Settle, quote, needed to go. And since Stark Fitz's home was being used as a hub for their criminal activity anyway, they decided they would murder him there. Stanley was to be the triggerman, and Guidry was supposed to assist with the murder as needed. Burke provided Stanley with a .22 caliber revolver equipped with a makeshift silencer. In order to bring Settle to the area, they came up with a credible ruse, telling Settle that they had decided that they were going to murder Gribble over what had happened to Word, and that because he'd screwed up, he needed to help them pull it off. Settle willingly took part in what he believed was a conspiracy to murder Gribble, fully unaware that he was assisting in his own murder. Guidry had stolen a Nissan Maxima from Houston, and the group pulled out its contents, including a manual, registration, and a spare tire, then began lining the inside with plastic bags. At some point on March 14th, 2011, Stanley shot Settle in the head, and the group dropped him in the trunk while they debated where to dump his body and dispose of the Maxima. After a couple hours, though, they heard moaning from inside the truck, a horrifying indication that Settle was still barely alive. Guidry handed Stanley the gun and told him to, quote, put him out of his misery. And Stanley obeyed. Around dawn that morning, they took 2 cars to a remote area at the end of a secluded logging trail and used lighter fluid to torch the Maxima and Settle's remains. It would take 9 days before a passerby discovered the Maxima and called police. While that was going on, the four sought refuge at an SWS's members' home in Madisonville, Texas, then got hotel rooms in Arlington, where they laid low for several days. Guidry and Stanley were both promoted in rank in the SWS for their roles in the murder. We're going to state the obvious here. The details we just described came from court documents filed by prosecutors, and no one in law enforcement could have ever learned those specific details unless an eyewitness provided them. But throughout the case, the prosecution was extremely careful to not divulge the names of the informants, except in several plea agreements that name Gribble as a, quote, cooperating witness to the drug trafficking crimes. Police solved the murder by using the Maxima. They pulled a VIN plate off of the burnt car and were able to quickly tie Guidry to the Houston vehicle theft. Just 2 days after the Maxima was discovered, Stanley was arrested in Tyler County for being a felon in possession of a .357 pistol and ammunition. 2 days after that, police raided Stark Fitz's home and arrested her and Bork, who attempted to hide behind a vehicle in the driveway. They found several guns, including a pistol that had been hidden in a speaker and a ballistics vest. But most importantly, they also discovered key items that the four had apparently forgotten to dispose of: the spare tire, vehicle registration, and insurance documents from the Maxima. At that point, there was little Bork and Stark Fitz could do to explain it away. As the investigation progressed, the U.S. Department of Justice took over and decided it would charge everybody for everything. A dozen SWS members and associates were rounded up on a single indictment, including the 4 people involved in Settle's murder, as well as Craig Phipps, Michael Word, Juanette and Mickle Cunningham, and even people whose alleged gang crimes had been selling as little as a half gram of meth for SWS members. None of those charged decided to take their cases to trial. Even Guidry, Bork, and Stanley, who all received life terms after admitting to various roles in the murder. When it came time for Bork to be sentenced, Vivian Settle spoke in court, recounting at the January 6, 2014 hearing that she still felt guilty for turning her son into jail years ago, where he first met members of the SWS. Quote, "The defendant not only took my son, my best friend, but also a part of me," she said. "We could always talk to one another about anything. Once a handsome face, a loyal friend, and a big heart, now sits silently in a box by my bed." At Vicky Stark Fitz hearing, her attorney begged for mercy, stating that she had gone through so many personal tragedies, including watching her own son be killed in front of her in 2002. Then Vicky rose to speak and said, looking back, she wishes she had stopped things from escalating. Quote, "Every night I lay in bed, I wish I could trade places with Lil Bit. He was my friend. And I pray for his family every night because I know what it feels like to lose a young son like that. And I have great remorse. I really do." The prosecution called it crocodile tears. U.S. District Judge Marcia Crone sentenced her to 31 years, leaving a smidgen of hope for her to be released someday if she can overcome the lower life expectancy that comes from long-term incarceration. As it stands now, Stark Fitz is scheduled to be released in 2039. At age 75. She's tried to get out sooner, even filing compassionate release petitions at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the prosecution has consistently hit back with this counter-argument: that while she may not have played a big role in the murder, she was heavily involved in the cover-up. But perhaps more significantly, in a world where a white supremacist gang was plotting to fund a segregationist colony with meth proceeds, Vicky Stark Fitz held enormous power. As the person with a solid drug connection and access to guns, in many ways, she was the catalyst for all that transpired.